The millionaire's girlfriend humiliated his childhood nanny and his action. The Alexander estate shone brightly with lights. The atmosphere was filled with anticipation because today, Alexander was bringing Victoria home to meet his family. Rose stood in the corner of the living room, her hands slightly clenched as she saw Alexander walk in with a young, beautiful woman whose eyes were sharp and cold. "Victoria." "Rose, I'm home." Alexander beamed, unable to hide his pride as he introduced the woman beside him. "This is Victoria, my fiancée." Rose smiled gently and stepped forward to welcome them. "Hello, Victoria. I'm Rose. I've taken care of Alexander since he was a child." Victoria raised an eyebrow, her gaze scrutinizing Rose from head to toe. The older woman wore a simple dress, her silver hair neatly tied back, her smile warm yet somewhat hesitant in the face of the young woman's attitude. "So this is the person who took care of you?" Victoria's voice was icy, laced with disdain. "How pathetic. An old, poor woman like this is still lingering around your house." The room fell into silence. Some of Alexander's relatives exchanged uneasy glances. Rose lowered her head slightly, but there was pain hidden in her eyes. Alexander let out an awkward chuckle and gently pulled Victoria's hand. "Come on, don't joke like that." Victoria shrugged, crossing her arms over her chest, but her eyes remained indifferent. "I'm not joking. I'm just surprised. A servant being treated like family? How strange." Mrs. Margaret, an older relative of Alexander, cleared her throat to break the tense silence. "Rose is not just a servant. She raised Alexander since he was a child." "Oh, really?" Victoria smirked. "Then she must be quite good at earning everyone's loyalty here." Victoria's words cut into Rose like a knife. She remained silent, not arguing back. She had spent her entire life caring for Alexander, never expecting anything in return. But now, her presence was seen as an inconvenience. "Dinner is ready. Let's go to the table," Alexander quickly said, trying to ease the atmosphere. The family moved toward the dining room, where an elegant feast had been prepared. Rose was about to follow when Victoria suddenly spoke up. "Is she sitting at the table with us too?" The dining room fell silent again. Rose hesitated slightly. "Rose always has dinner with the family," Alexander replied, but there was hesitation in his voice. "Really? I thought she was just a servant, not a family member." Victoria raised an eyebrow. Rose said nothing, quietly taking a seat at the corner of the table. A maid named Emma, a young woman who had worked in the house for years, whispered to her. "Don't mind her, Mrs. Rose." Rose gave a weak smile. But Victoria's cruelty didn't stop there. Throughout dinner, Victoria continued to make snide remarks. "It's so strange for an old servant to still be lingering in this house. Maybe because she doesn't know how to do anything other than freeload." Alexander looked slightly uncomfortable, but he said nothing. "Actually, Rose is more than just a servant. She raised him like her own son." Margaret spoke up, clearly displeased with Victoria's attitude. "How interesting. I thought Alexander was a decisive man, but it turns out he's easily swayed by things that aren't worth it." Rose silently endured, but the others at the table were growing more uncomfortable. "Victoria, you don't have to say that," Alexander gently reminded her, though he still wasn't firm. "Why not? I'm just speaking the truth." Emma, the young maid, clenched her fists. She had seen Rose dedicate her life to this household, and there was nothing about her that deserved such disrespect. "I think we should change the subject," Margaret said, clearly trying to control the situation. But Victoria didn't care. She picked up her glass of red wine, took a sip, then suddenly swung her hand, causing the deep red liquid to spill straight onto Rose's dress. "Oh, I didn't expect you to be so clumsy. Why do you still keep someone like this around, Alexander?" The entire table froze. Rose trembled slightly, her hands tightening around the edge of her dress. Alexander looked at the scene before him but still said nothing. His gaze flickered between Rose and Victoria, as if he was struggling internally but couldn't decide whom to defend. Margaret set her knife down on her plate with a sharp clatter, her eyes cold as she looked at Victoria. "You've gone too far, Victoria." But Victoria only let out a dry laugh. "It was just an accident. No need for everyone to overreact." Rose didn't say a word. She simply stood up, bowed gently to the table, and walked out. "Mrs. Rose." Emma hurried after her, but Rose shook her head slightly, signaling her not to say anything. Inside the dining room, a heavy silence filled the air. Alexander still said nothing, merely taking a sip of his wine. Margaret turned to her nephew, her voice serious. "Alexander, do you really think Victoria is the right person for you? Someone who doesn't even know how to respect others?" Alexander remained silent. For the first time that evening, he felt that something was wrong. But Victoria's expression remained confident, as if she had done nothing wrong. Outside, Rose stood in the darkness of the vast garden, her eyes filled with sorrow. She had spent her whole life caring for Alexander, yet now, she felt like a stranger in the very home she had devoted herself to. The night wind blew past, carrying a biting cold, but it was nothing compared to the loneliness constricting her heart. Dinner ended in suffocating tension. Alexander's relatives had all realized how cruel Victoria was, but no one dared to say it outright because Alexander had yet to speak up. In the kitchen, Rose silently washed the wine stain from her dress, her hands trembling slightly. Emma stood beside her, unable to hide her anger. "You can't just stay silent like this, Mrs. Rose." Rose shook her head, giving a weak smile. "My dear, how people choose to treat me is their decision. But how I choose to respond, that is what truly matters." Emma clenched her fists. "But you don't deserve to be treated like this. Alexander was terrible too. He didn't defend you at all." Rose remained silent. Yes, Alexander had been silent. "Why is everyone looking at me like I just did something awful?" Victoria asked, feigning innocence. Margaret, who had always held deep respect for Rose, could no longer hide her frustration. "Because you were awful, Victoria. You can't treat Rose like that. She's not just some stranger, she's the woman who raised Alexander." "Oh, how touching." Victoria let out a laugh. "But if she's really so important, why is she still just an old maid?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the living room. Alexander frowned but still said nothing. "Aren't you going to say anything, Alexander?" Margaret looked at her nephew, disappointment clear in her eyes. Alexander looked at Victoria, then at his family members. "Come on, let's not make a big deal out of this. It's just a misunderstanding." Victoria smirked in satisfaction, pleased that Alexander hadn't reprimanded her. Rose stepped out from the kitchen, intending to slip away quietly so as not to disturb anyone. But Victoria wouldn't let her go so easily. "Oh, you're still here." Everyone turned to look at Rose. She stopped in her tracks, her expression calm but burdened with sadness. "I was just finishing up before heading to bed." Victoria smirked. "It's strange that a servant can just go to sleep comfortably in this house. I thought you would have your own separate quarters somewhere, rather than taking up a room in this mansion." Margaret slammed her teacup down onto the table, no longer hiding her anger. "That's enough, Victoria." But Victoria still showed no remorse. "I'm just saying what I think. Is that so wrong?" Rose spoke softly, her voice steady but filled with pain. "Miss Victoria, I have been here since Alexander was a child. To me, this place is home." Victoria burst into laughter. "Home? Do you really think so? An old maid still believing she's part of the family?" Rose did not answer. She only bowed her head, but those who paid close attention could see her hands clutching the hem of her dress tightly. Alexander stood there, his gaze wavering. He said nothing, in either defending Rose nor reprimanding Victoria. In the end, it was Margaret who broke the silence. "You should rethink your choices, Alexander." With that, she stood up and left the living room, her disappointment evident. Her small room was located in a quiet corner of the estate, not far from where Alexander's childhood bedroom had been. She still kept old keepsakes, pictures of young Alexander, the toys he used to hold as he slept. She let out a long sigh. She had always loved Alexander as if he were her own son, but perhaps now, she no longer had a place in his life. A gentle knock sounded on the door. "Mrs. Rose, it's me, Emma." Rose opened the door, and Emma stepped in, her face full of concern. "Are you really going to stay silent forever? Don't you think this is unfair?" Rose smiled faintly and placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "My dear, sometimes silence isn't about surrendering, it's about maturity." Emma bit her lip, clearly unhappy with that response. "But you don't deserve to be treated like this. At the very least, Alexander should have spoken up for you." Rose said nothing. In her heart, Alexander's silence was what hurt the most. Meanwhile, in another part of the house, Alexander felt a vague discomfort. Everyone in the family was clearly displeased with Victoria's behavior, but he didn't know what to do. Victoria was lounging on the sofa, flipping through a fashion magazine. She glanced up when she saw Alexander. "You look tense." Alexander sat down with a sigh. "I just think things got a little out of hand yesterday." "Out of hand? What do you mean?" Victoria raised an eyebrow. "You could have been a bit kinder to Rose. She took care of me when I was a child." Victoria laughed and put the magazine down. "Are you defending her?" "I'm not defending anyone. I just think you should have shown more respect." Victoria crossed her arms and looked straight into Alexander's eyes. "I was just expressing my thoughts. If that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe the problem isn't with me, it's with you." Alexander fell silent. He didn't know how to respond. At that moment, the living room door opened. Margaret entered, accompanied by Rose. "Mrs. Rose, are you all right?" Margaret asked gently. Rose nodded, but it was clear to everyone that she looked more exhausted than usual. Margaret turned to Alexander. "Do you really have nothing to say about all this?" Alexander swallowed hard. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, waiting for him to speak. But before he could open his mouth, Victoria spoke first. "Do we really need to keep dragging this out? Let's not let something so trivial ruin the family atmosphere." Margaret looked straight at Victoria. "The issue isn't whether it's big or small, it's about how you treat others." Victoria smirked but didn't reply. Alexander suddenly felt a heavy weight in his chest. He had grown so used to Rose's kindness that he had never stopped to think that she, too, could be hurt. But by the time he realized it, perhaps it was already too late. A few days later, Alexander's family hosted a small party at the estate to introduce Victoria to their close friends. That evening, the living room was bathed in the warm glow of golden lights. Crystal glasses shimmered on the dining table. Guests, including many of Alexander's longtime friends, engaged in lively conversation, all eager to learn more about his fiancée. As always, Rose remained in the background, quietly carrying out her duties. She helped the servants prepare the food and arranged the seating. But she never expected to become the center of attention in such a cruel way. Victoria sat in the middle of the room, exuding confidence, her gaze scanning those around her with arrogant amusement. A group of Alexander's friends approached her, chatting enthusiastically. "So, Alexander has finally decided to settle down?" A man with curly hair and a white dress shirt laughed. "Yes, but I must say, I'm surprised he still keeps certain old things around in this house." Victoria smirked, her eyes flicking toward Rose. The group fell silent for a brief moment, immediately understanding the implication. A blonde woman, Marissa, glanced at Alexander, waiting for his reaction. But as usual, Alexander merely smiled faintly and said nothing. "What do you mean by that, Victoria?" Marissa asked, her tone slightly irritated. "Oh, it's nothing," Victoria said with an exaggerated shrug. "I just find it odd that in a mansion like this, there's still such an outdated servant hanging around." Rose heard her but did not react. She simply continued setting the table, her head lowered. But Emma, standing beside her, could no longer stay silent. "Mrs. Rose is not just a servant." Victoria let out a laugh. "Oh really? Then what is she?" "A vintage decoration that just never got thrown out." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Many of them looked uncomfortable with Victoria's words. A middle-aged man named Andrew shook his head and sighed. "Miss Victoria, you're insulting a very respectable woman." "Insulting?" Victoria raised an eyebrow. "I'm just stating the truth. A servant should know her place." Alexander, sitting beside Victoria, was clearly uncomfortable. But, as always, he said nothing. The party continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Alexander's family members, especially Margaret, made no attempt to hide their displeasure. She kept casting sharp glances at Alexander, silently urging him to speak up. But the worst was yet to come. "Mrs. Rose, could you pour me some more wine?" Rose nodded and stepped forward. Just as she picked up the bottle, suddenly, Victoria yanked her hand sharply, causing the wine glass to spill all over Rose's dress. The deep red liquid soaked into the fabric, leaving a stark stain. The entire room fell silent. "Oh my goodness!" Victoria gasped theatrically. "How clumsy of you! How did you manage to spill wine all over yourself like that?" The entire table sat frozen. Some guests exchanged shocked glances, unable to believe what had just happened. Rose stood still, her hands trembling slightly. But she didn't say a word. She merely took a step back. "I'm sorry. I'll go change." But Victoria wasn't finished. She smirked and turned to Alexander. "Do you see this, Alexander? I honestly don't understand why you still keep her in this house. An old, clumsy woman like that only makes everything more of a mess." Alexander stiffened, his fingers tightening around his glass. But in the end, he still said nothing. Emma couldn't take it anymore. She shot to her feet, her face flushed with anger. "You've gone too far, Victoria. You spilled that wine on Mrs. Rose and now you're blaming her." "Oh." Victoria chuckled. "Is the little maid getting upset over the old woman? How touching." "You." Emma made a move toward her, but Rose gently placed a hand on her arm and shook her head. "It's all right, Emma." Without another word, Rose turned and quietly left the dining table. Alexander watched her go, his lips pressed tightly together. A strange feeling swelled in his chest, a mixture of discomfort and shame. The other guests also felt uncomfortable. Margaret set her knife down on her plate with a sharp clang, her voice firm and unwavering. "Victoria, you've gone too far. Too far." Victoria tilted her head with mock innocence. "I was merely stating the truth." "The truth?" Margaret stared at her, her gaze piercing. "No, that wasn't the truth. That was sheer disrespect." Victoria shrugged, maintaining her smug expression. "If everyone wants to paint me as the villain, go ahead. I simply don't like unnecessary things cluttering my life." Her words cut deep into everyone sitting in the room. Alexander could no longer ignore the discomfort gnawing at his conscience. For years, he had always considered Rose as family. And yet tonight, when she was openly humiliated in front of him, he had done nothing. What was he thinking? Why had he remained silent? "What's wrong?" Victoria stepped closer, draping her arm over Alexander's shoulder. Alexander turned to look at her. For the first time, he truly saw Victoria saw who she really was. Did you really have to do that? His voice was low. Do what? Victoria raised an eyebrow. Humiliate Rose like that? Victoria let out a laugh. Are you blaming me now? You never had a problem when I spoke about her before. So why are you suddenly feeling guilty? Alexander fell silent. She was right. He had been silent before. But why? Maybe it was because he had never realized that his silence could wound someone who mattered so much. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that Rose had once held when he was a child, the same hands she had taught to hold a pen, to tie his shoelaces. Suddenly, a deep, suffocating shame washed over him. But perhaps, it was too late. After the party, the estate was shrouded in a heavy silence. The guests had all left, but the atmosphere had not returned to normal. Alexander's family members still whispered about what had happened. Rose had quietly retreated to her room after being humiliated in front of everyone. No one had seen her fight back, and no one had heard her complain. But her silence was what made those with a conscience feel the most guilt. Alexander sat alone in the living room, his eyes fixed on the glass of wine in his hands. Victoria's words, the way she had treated Rose, it all played vividly in his mind. But what unsettled him the most was himself, his own silence. The door creaked open. Margaret stepped inside, arms crossed, her expression stern as she looked at her nephew. What are you thinking, Alexander? Alexander looked up at her, exhaling a weary sigh as he set his glass down on the table. What are you talking about? Margaret sat down across from him, her voice cutting through the air like steel. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Victoria spent the entire evening humiliating Rose without an ounce of restraint. Don't tell me you didn't notice. Alexander rubbed his temples, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Aunt Margaret, I know Victoria was a little harsh, but maybe she just isn't used to the way things work around here. She didn't mean any harm. Margaret let out a dry laugh. Didn't mean any harm. Think what you want. But what disappoints me the most isn't Victoria, it's you. Alexander frowned. Me? Yes. You sat there and watched Rose be degraded in front of everyone, and you didn't say a single word to defend her. The woman who dedicated her entire life to raising you. Margaret's voice grew sharper. I truly don't understand. Who are you, Alexander? Because the boy I once knew would never stand by and allow such injustice to happen. Margaret's words cut through Alexander like a knife. He lowered his head, his hands clenched tightly. I just didn't want to cause tension. Didn't want to cause tension. Margaret shook her head in disappointment. Do you think your silence didn't cause harm? If Rose doesn't matter to you, then say it outright. But if she does, then you cannot treat her this way. Alexander didn't respond. He had no excuse. Mrs. Rose didn't deserve to be treated like that. Alexander and Margaret turned toward the voice. Standing in the doorway was Andrew, a close friend of the family. A middle-aged man, he had witnessed Rose raising Alexander since childhood. I saw everything that happened tonight. Andrew stepped forward, his expression serious. I know you, Alexander. You're not a heartless person. But you're letting Victoria cloud your judgment. A heavy weight settled in Alexander's chest. He could no longer deny it. Alexander hesitated. If you keep staying silent, it won't just be Rose who gets hurt. You'll end up losing what matters most to you. Andrew said, then patted Alexander's shoulder before walking away. Margaret remained, her gaze filled with disappointment. Think carefully, Alexander. Don't wait until it's too late. With that, she turned and left, leaving Alexander alone in the vast room. For the first time, he realized that his choices could cost him something truly precious. Rose sat on her bed, looking down at the dark stain of red wine still visible on her dress. She wasn't angry, just sad. She had spent her entire life caring for Alexander, yet tonight, she had been humiliated in front of him, and he had done nothing to stop it. Emma entered the room, carrying a fresh set of clothes. "Here, change into this. I'll wash that dress for you." Rose smiled softly. "Thank you, Emma." But Emma couldn't hide her frustration. "Aren't you angry at Alexander? For not standing up for you?" Rose quietly folded her dress, then let out a long sigh. "I'm not angry. But I am sad. Why don't you say something? Why don't you tell him to speak up?" Rose stared into the distance, her voice calm but laced with sorrow. If a person doesn't realize what's right on their own, then no amount of words will change anything. Emma fell silent. She didn't know how to respond. She looked at Rose, her heart aching for the older woman. Rose had always been kind and selfless. But perhaps it was her silence that made Alexander feel the most guilt. The next morning, Alexander walked down to the dining room but didn't see Rose. "Where's Mrs. Rose?" he asked one of the servants. "She woke up early and went to the garden, sir." Alexander nodded. He stepped outside, following the familiar path to the garden, where Rose was watering the flowers. Watching her from behind, Alexander felt something unfamiliar in his chest. It wasn't the usual sense of familiarity, it was something fragile, as if he didn't act soon, she would slip away from his life forever. He stepped closer, about to speak, but before he could, Rose spoke first. "Good morning, Alexander." Her voice was as gentle as ever, as if nothing had happened. Alexander opened his mouth but didn't know what to say. In the end, all he could manage was a simple question. "Are you okay?" Rose turned to look at him, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "I'm fine, my boy." Her smile was just as kind as it had always been. But deep within her gaze, Alexander could see that something had changed. She wasn't angry at him. But she no longer expected anything from him. And that hurt more than any scolding ever could. The sun had risen high, but Alexander still lay motionless on the bed. His head throbbed like a hammer pounding against his skull from drinking too much the night before. But the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the emptiness in his heart. The image of Rose leaving the banquet, her dress stained with spilled wine, kept replaying in his mind. He remembered Margaret's disappointed gaze, Andrew's bitter reproaches, and most of all, Rose's gentle yet deeply wounded smile. He had been wrong. But he didn't know what to do to make things right. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. "Young master, are you awake?" Alexander recognized the voice of Cameron, the family's loyal butler. He took a deep breath before replying. "I'm awake." The door creaked open, and Cameron stepped inside, carrying a cup of hot coffee. He placed it on the bedside table and looked at Alexander with a serious expression. "Young master, if I may speak frankly, this estate has never felt this heavy before. And it's all because of what happened last night." Alexander propped himself up on his elbows, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I know, but I don't know what to do." Cameron stared at him for a long moment before letting out a sigh. "You don't know what to do? Do you really not know, or do you just not want to face the truth?" Alexander remained silent. Cameron continued, his voice deep and steady. "Madame Rose has cared for you since you were a child. She has spent her whole life sacrificing for you. Yet last night, in front of everyone, she was humiliated. And you did nothing to protect her." A sharp, invisible blade cut through Alexander's heart. "I didn't mean to," he murmured. "Didn't mean to?" Cameron raised an eyebrow. "Then what would you call your silence? Carelessness or indifference?" Alexander had no answer. Cameron studied him for a moment longer before shaking his head. If you don't do something soon, you will lose the most important person in your life and there will be no way to undo it. With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Alexander alone with his chaotic thoughts. On the other side of the estate, Rose was tidying up her small room. Even though Emma had begged her to rest after what had happened the night before, Rose carried on with her work as usual. But today, everything felt heavier. Not because her body was weaker, but because her heart was burdened. Emma stepped inside, carrying a tray of hot tea. "Madam Rose, you need to rest." Rose gave her a gentle smile. "I'm fine, my dear." But Emma didn't believe her. She set the tray down and clenched her hands tightly. "Aren't you angry? Aren't you hurt? Alexander didn't say a single word to defend you." The smile on Rose's lips faltered slightly. "Do you think I should be angry?" Emma bit her lip. "At the very least, you shouldn't forgive so easily." Rose looked at Emma, her eyes filled with understanding. "People make mistakes, my dear. But what truly matters is whether they realize those mistakes or not." Emma lowered her head, feeling helpless. "But, what if he never realizes it?" Rose let out a weary sigh. "Then perhaps, it's time for me to leave." Emma's eyes widened in shock. "What? Leave?" Rose nodded softly. "I have spent my life caring for Alexander. But if I am no longer a part of his world, then I shouldn't stay." Emma clenched her fists, anger and sorrow welling up inside her on Rose's behalf. He felt a discomfort spreading in his heart. For the first time in his life, his own home felt unfamiliar. He looked around. Everything was the same, the grand estate he had lived in since childhood. But now, it felt empty. At that moment, Margaret stepped in. "Are you looking for someone, Alexander?" Alexander hesitated, then asked. "Where is Madame Rose?" Margaret crossed her arms, her gaze stern. "Do you really care?" The question caught Alexander off guard. "Of course, I care." Margaret smirked. "Then why didn't you say a word when she was humiliated last night?" Alexander was at a loss for words. Margaret sighed. "Madame Rose is thinking about leaving." Alexander froze. "Leaving?" "Yes. You've made her feel like she no longer has a place in this house." A heavy weight settled in his chest. Rose, leaving? She had been by his side throughout his childhood. She was the one who held his hand when he was sick, who stayed up through the night when he was afraid. And now, she wanted to leave because of him. A strange fear crept into his heart, a fear that if he didn't act now, he would lose her forever. Without another word, Alexander rushed toward Rose's room. But when he arrived, the door was shut. He hesitated, then knocked softly. "Madame Rose?" No response. Alexander took a deep breath, then pushed the door open. The first thing he saw was a small suitcase, neatly placed beside the bed. And at that moment, he knew he had gone too far. Alexander stood frozen, staring at the small suitcase. It sat neatly by the bed, an unmistakable sign Rose had truly decided to leave. His heart felt unbearably heavy. For the first time, he realized he might lose her forever. Rose slowly emerged from the corner of the room, a small cloth in her hand. She paused when she saw Alexander, but then simply gave him a gentle smile. "What are you doing here, Alexander?" Her voice was as soft as always, but there was a distance in it that made his heart tighten. Alexander stared at the suitcase, then turned to her. "Are you really leaving?" Rose gently placed the cloth down on a chair before sitting beside the bed. "Perhaps, it's time." A wave of fear washed over him. "You can't leave." Rose smiled, but her eyes were filled with sorrow. "Why not? This is no longer my home." Alexander clenched his fists. "What are you saying?" This has always been your home. Rose shook her head, her voice heavy with sadness. My dear boy, if this were truly my home, then I wouldn't feel so out of place. It felt like a punch to his chest. Rose felt like a stranger in the very house she had spent her life in. He looked at her, and for the first time, he noticed the deep lines on her face not just from time, but from the pain he had unknowingly caused. Alexander pulled up a chair and sat in front of her. You can't leave, Rose. You're my family. Rose smiled, but it lacked the warmth it once had. Family? She looked at him, her voice as light as a breeze. Are you sure, Alexander? He nodded immediately. Of course. I grew up because of you. I love you like my own mother. Rose remained silent for a long time. Then she sighed softly. If I were truly your family, then why were you silent last night? Alexander froze. He had no answer. He could make excuses, say that he didn't want to create conflict, that he only wanted to keep the peace with Victoria. But deep down, he knew there was no excuse that could justify his silence. Rose looked at him for a long time before gently shaking her head. Do you know something, Alexander? It's not cruel words that hurt the most. It's silence. A bitter feeling rose in Alexander's chest. Are you angry with me? He asked quietly. Rose shook her head. I'm not angry. But I am disappointed. Those words hurt more than any reproach ever could. She wasn't angry because she no longer expected anything from him. Alexander felt his throat tighten. Please, don't go, he pleaded. Rose smiled kindly, reaching up to gently run her fingers through his hair just as she used to when he was a child. Alexander, you've grown up. You don't need me anymore. No. That's not true. Alexander grasped her hand, his eyes filled with regret. You are a part of my life. I can't imagine this house without you. Rose looked deep into his eyes. Then why did you let them treat me that way? Alexander lowered his head, unable to answer. Rose didn't press him for a response. She simply withdrew her hand from his, then stood up. I don't blame you, Alexander. I just think, maybe it's time for me to leave. A wave of desperation washed over him. He had never imagined a day when Rose would leave him. But now, as he faced that reality, it felt as though he was losing a part of himself. He knew that if he let her go, he would never have the chance to make things right. Just then, Emma burst into the room, her face flushed with anger. Madam Rose, you can't leave. If you go, who will take care of Master Alexander? Rose chuckled. He's a grown man now, Emma. He can take care of himself. But Emma shook her head, her eyes burning with indignation. No, he can't. If he could, he wouldn't have let you be hurt like this. Alexander flinched at her words. Emma had never spoken to him in such a tone before. But she wasn't wrong. He had let Rose be hurt. Emma turned to Alexander, her gaze sharp. Master Alexander, if you truly care about Madame Rose, then do something. If you don't, you will lose her forever. Her words rang like a bell in his mind. Alexander looked at Rose. She still stood there, her gaze gentle but without expectation. He knew that if he didn't act now, there would be no second chance. Taking a deep breath, Alexander stepped forward and knelt before her. Madame Rose, I'm sorry. Rose's eyes widened in surprise, and even Emma was stunned. Alexander bowed his head low, his voice filled with sincerity. I was wrong. I didn't protect you. I let you down. But please, don't leave. Rose gazed at him for a long time. Finally, she reached out, gently placing a hand on his head, stroking his hair just as she did when he was a boy. Alexander, you must find the answer yourself. I can't tell you what to do. Alexander clenched his fists. He knew what he had to do. After speaking with Rose, he stepped out of her room with a heavy heart. He had never felt so lost before. Emma watched him go, her eyes filled with disdain. She had once respected Alexander. But now, she wasn't sure she could anymore. Alexander wandered through the estate, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. A part of him wanted to believe that Victoria had no ill intentions, but another part couldn't forget what she had done to Rose. In the end, he decided to find Victoria. He needed to hear it from her. When Alexander entered the drawing room, he saw Victoria lounging comfortably in a chair, laughing and chatting with a group of her friends. "Well, this estate is beautiful, but there are far too many unnecessary things here. Especially certain old-fashioned relics." The group burst into laughter. Alexander froze at the words. One of the men, Gabriel, a friend of Victoria's, tilted his head and asked, "Who are you talking about?" Victoria shrugged, taking a sip of wine. "Who else? That poor old maid. You wouldn't believe how pathetic she looked with wine spilled all over her dress." Laughter erupted once more. Alexander stood there, stunned. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Victoria felt no remorse. On the contrary, she found Rose's quiet endurance amusing. His hands clenched into fists. A wave of anger surged through him, an anger he had never felt before. He strode straight toward Victoria. "We need to talk." Victoria glanced up, raising an eyebrow in surprise. "Oh, Alexander, you finally decided to show up. We can talk later, I have guests." But Alexander didn't care. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her up from the chair. "Right now." Without waiting for her response, he dragged her out of the drawing room under the stunned gazes of her friends. Once they reached the empty hallway, Alexander let go of her arm. "What did you just say in there?" His voice was low, dangerous. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about? You mocked Rose in front of your friends, didn't you?" Victoria laughed. "You're overreacting, Alexander. It was just a joke." "A joke?" Alexander stared at her, his voice sharp. "You really think that was funny?" Victoria folded her arms, her tone turning cold. "Alexander, I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this. She's just an old maid. Why are you acting like it's so important?" The words felt like a slap to his face. "Rose is not just a maid." His voice dropped lower, each word deliberate. "She is my family." Victoria let out a scornful laugh. "Family? A poor old servant is what you consider family?" Alexander felt his blood boil. He had stayed silent for too long. He had let Victoria insult Rose, let her cross the line too many times. And now, he couldn't stand it any longer. He met her gaze, his voice as sharp as a blade. "If you can't respect Rose, then you don't deserve to be in my life." Victoria's eyes widened before she let out a laugh. "Are you serious? You're going to throw me away over a maid?" Alexander clenched his fists. "Do you know what disgusts me the most about you, Victoria? It's not your wealth, it's not your arrogance. It's the way you so shamelessly look down on others." Victoria suddenly narrowed her eyes, realizing that the situation was slipping out of her control. "Alexander, you're letting your emotions get the best of you. You love me, don't you?" But for the first time, Alexander no longer saw Victoria as beautiful or charming. He only saw her as someone truly dreadful. "I don't think I even know who you are anymore." Victoria's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" Alexander nodded. "Pack your things." Victoria froze. "Are you kicking me out?" "Yes." Victoria let out a laugh, but this time, it was distorted with anger. "You're going to regret this, Alexander." But Alexander no longer cared. He turned and walked away, leaving Victoria standing there, too furious to speak. Alexander strode quickly to the garden, where Rose was tending to the flower beds. She didn't turn around at the sound of his footsteps, but Alexander knew she had sensed his presence. He stopped, took a deep breath, and said, "Madam Rose, I told Victoria to pack her things." Rose slowly turned to him, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "Is that your decision?" Alexander nodded. "You were right. I was wrong. I stayed silent for too long. But from now on, I won't let anyone hurt you again." Rose looked at him for a long moment. Then, she smiled. "My little boy has finally grown up." Alexander felt his eyes sting. He had made mistakes, but this time, he would make things right with everything he had. Though Alexander had told Victoria to pack her things, she wasn't willing to accept being thrown out so easily. Instead of leaving immediately, she decided to throw a small party with her close friends, as if challenging Alexander's decision. She was confident that once she showed she was still in control, he would change his mind. That evening, the drawing room was once again filled with light. Laughter and chatter echoed through the halls, but this time, the atmosphere felt forced. The members of Alexander's family didn't bother to hide their discomfort, especially Margaret and Andrew. In one corner of the room, Emma and Cameron whispered to each other. "Does she really think she can just stay here?" Emma muttered, her eyes burning with anger. Cameron sighed, watching Alexander, who stood silently, observing everything. The young master has finally seen her true colors, but the question is, does he have the strength to end this for good? Emma clenched her fists. She doesn't belong here, and everyone knows it. But what worries me the most is Madame Rose. She's already endured enough. Cameron nodded in agreement. But just as they were speaking, something unexpected happened, something that pushed everything to its breaking point. Rose had been quietly tidying up the room, trying to keep her distance from the party. But that didn't mean Victoria was going to leave her alone. "Oh my, you're still here." Victoria's voice rang out, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room fell into silence. Rose stopped what she was doing but didn't reply. Victoria smirked, crossing her arms. "It's strange to see an old maid still hanging around like this. I thought you would have packed your things by now." All eyes turned to Alexander. Hot blood rushed to Alexander's head. But before he could speak, Andrew had already risen to his feet. "Miss Victoria, you've crossed the line." Margaret's voice followed, dripping with contempt. "Shameful. I have never seen anyone as disgraceful as you." Yet, Victoria showed no remorse. Instead, she feigned surprise. "I'm just stating the truth. If she had any sense, she wouldn't still be here." Holding her glass of red wine, Victoria smirked, then suddenly flung the entire glass at Rose. The deep crimson liquid soaked into Rose's dress, staining it like a splash of blood. The entire room froze. Andrew clenched his fists so tightly that it seemed like he would strike Victoria if she spoke another word. Emma shot up from her seat, her face flushed with fury. "What did you just do?" she shouted, her voice trembling with rage. But the only person who did not react strongly was Rose herself. She simply lowered her gaze, her expression void of anger or reproach, only an indescribable sadness, deep and vast. Alexander felt his entire world crumble. He had let this happen. He had allowed the woman who loved him most to be humiliated like this. This time, he could not remain silent. Victoria was still smirking, but when she met Alexander's eyes, her smile vanished. "Get out of here. Immediately." His voice held no hesitation. Victoria's eyes widened in shock. "What? Are you kicking me out?" Alexander didn't answer. He only stared at her, his gaze filled with nothing but disdain. "I was a fool to believe you were a good person. But now, I see clearly. You're not just cruel, you have no heart." Victoria let out a shaky laugh, but this time, there was fear beneath it. Alexander, do you really think I'll let you throw me out so easily? Alexander's lips curled into a cold smile. Do you think I'll beg you to stay? Victoria froze. She had never seen Alexander this firm before. The entire room was silent except for Victoria's ragged breathing and the expectant gazes of everyone around them. Then, Alexander spoke the words no one expected. You're not just being thrown out of this estate. Our wedding is cancelled. Victoria staggered back. You can't do this to me. I just did. Without another glance, Alexander turned away from her. Victoria clenched her fists, trembling with fury. You'll regret this, Alexander. You will regret this. But no one cared about her threats anymore. Andrew ordered the servants to pack Victoria's belongings, while Margaret stood by with her arms crossed, her gaze colder than ever. Emma rushed to Rose's side, hurriedly dabbing at the wine stains on her dress. But Rose remained silent. Not because she felt nothing but because she had endured so much that she no longer had the strength to react. Alexander closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in many days, he felt truly awake. He had made mistakes. He had hurt the most important person in his life. But now, he would set things right. After the party ended, a heavy tension settled over the estate. Victoria did not leave immediately as Alexander had demanded. She remained in her room, desperately trying to find a way to turn the situation in her favor. But this time, Alexander was fully awake. He sat in his study, staring at the glass of wine before him. Everything that had happened tonight was a brutal blow to his pride. He had let things go too far. He had stayed silent for too long. But now, he was going to make things right. The door suddenly swung open. Victoria stepped inside, her face still filled with confidence. But there was a flicker of unease in her eyes when she saw the icy look Alexander gave her. Alexander, I think we need to talk. Alexander set his glass down and slowly stood up. You're still here? Victoria raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I'm not going anywhere. You're just being emotional right now. By tomorrow, when you've calmed down, you'll realize that I'm the best choice for you. Alexander let out a cold laugh. The best choice. A woman who is cruel and utterly devoid of compassion. Victoria scoffed, crossing her arms. Alexander, you're letting your emotions get the better of you. Fine, I admit I was a little harsh with the old woman. But that's only because I want what's best for you. A man like you shouldn't let his life be weighed down by a poor old maid. Alexander clenched his fists. Madame Rose is not a burden. She is my family. Victoria sneered. Are you serious? A servant? That's who you call family? Alexander stepped closer, his gaze turning frigid. You'll never understand because you don't know how to love anyone but yourself. Victoria flinched slightly but quickly regained her composure. So what? You think you can just throw me out so easily? We had a wedding planned, Alexander. You can't humiliate me like this in front of everyone. Alexander smirked. Humiliate you? You did that yourself. Do you think anyone in my family could ever accept you after what you did tonight? Victoria gritted her teeth. Alexander, you'll regret this. You need me. I bring you status, reputation, a match worthy of your class. Alexander shook his head. I don't need status or reputation. I need people who genuinely care about me. He looked her straight in the eye, his voice firm. This wedding is cancelled. Pack your things and leave this house immediately. Victoria had grown used to Alexander being passive, used to his silence. But now, he stood before her with an unwavering resolve she had never seen before. A surge of fury rushed through her. You think I'll let this go? She screamed. I won't let you humiliate me like this. I'll tell the press. I'll make sure the whole world knows that you're a traitor. Alexander smirked. Go ahead. Let's see who will believe you after everything you've done. For the first time, true panic flickered in Victoria's eyes. She had lost control, the one thing she had always been sure she possessed. Alexander was no longer the man she thought she could manipulate. Her hands clenched into fists, her eyes blazing with fury. You'll regret this, Alexander. I swear, you'll regret it. But Alexander no longer cared about her threats. He stepped to the door and flung it open. Get out. Though Victoria tried to control the media, Alexander's family acted swiftly to handle the situation. Margaret and Andrew made an official statement. This engagement has been called off due to Victoria's blatant disrespect toward our family. People began whispering about what had truly happened at the estate. Those who had attended the party recounted everything they had witnessed. Victoria's carefully crafted image collapsed overnight. She was no longer the perfect woman in the eyes of high society. She was shunned, mocked. And worse, there was nothing she could do to change it. Rose paid no attention to the news, nor did she want to hear anything about Victoria anymore. But when Alexander entered her room one morning, she knew something had changed. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his own, his voice full of sincerity. Madam Rose, I'm sorry. Rose looked at him, her eyes as gentle as always. You don't need to kneel before me, Alexander. Alexander shook his head. I was wrong. I let you get hurt. I didn't protect you when you needed me most. He took a deep breath, then said with unwavering determination. But from now on, I will never let that happen again. Rose smiled. She knew now at last, the boy she had raised had truly grown up. And this time, she no longer felt alone. News of Alexander and Victoria's broken engagement spread like wildfire. At first, Victoria tried to control the public narrative, but no one believed in the perfect image she had once built. The guests at the party had seen firsthand how she had humiliated Rose, and they did not hesitate to speak the truth. The public quickly turned against Victoria. Major newspapers ran headlines like, Victoria the arrogant fiancée who destroyed her own reputation. The truth about the Alexander estate party, how one woman lost everything due to her own cruelty. No one admired Victoria anymore. Brands that had once sought her endorsement severed their contracts. The high society connections she had once prided herself on abandoned her. She had gone from being one of the most sought-after women in the elite circle to a name spoken only with disdain. But the bitterest pill for Victoria was not the loss of her reputation. It was the undeniable truth that Alexander had truly left her. She still couldn't believe that the man who had once been blinded by her could now be so resolute. She tried calling him, but no one answered. She went to the estate, but the gates were firmly shut. She had lost him, and this time, there was no way back. Alexander wanted to make things right. He wanted to do anything he could to show Madame Rose that he cherished her as the most important person in his life. One morning, as Rose was watering the flowers in the garden, Alexander approached her with a small box in his hands. Madame Rose, I have something for you. Rose turned, glancing at the box. What is it, my boy? Alexander gently opened it, revealing a simple yet elegant gold necklace. I remember when I was little, you once said that you had always wanted a gift from the person you loved most. Rose smiled, but there was a deep emotion in her eyes. You didn't have to do this, Alexander. No, you deserve this. Alexander insisted. You have given me so much. You have loved me unconditionally. I can never repay you for all you've done, but at the very least, I can do this. He carefully fastened the necklace around her neck. Rose touched it gently, her heart warmer than it had ever been. My boy has truly grown up. Alexander held her hands firmly. I will never let you feel alone again. Meanwhile, Victoria had completely broken down. There was no one left on her side anymore. The friends who once surrounded her only for fame and money were now avoiding her. She sat alone in her luxurious apartment, staring at her phone, which was filled with dozens of missed calls, all rejections, cancellations from business partners. She couldn't accept the fact that she had lost everything. She desperately tried to arrange one last meeting with Alexander, but he immediately refused. She sent dozens of messages, pleading for a chance to explain. But there was no reply. Finally, she understood that Alexander had truly left her. For the first time in her life, Victoria felt the crushing weight of loneliness. No money, no power, no fame. She had only herself left and an emptiness that could never be filled. A week later, Alexander hosted a small gathering at his estate to honor Rose. All his loved ones were present: Margaret, Andrew, Emma, Cameron, and many others. When everyone had settled into their seats, Alexander stood up, raising his glass of wine. "Tonight, we are not just here to enjoy an ordinary dinner. We are here to honor someone I am deeply grateful for, Mrs. Rose." The room erupted in applause, but Rose simply shook her head and smiled gently. Alexander continued, his voice filled with sincerity. "I have made mistakes. I let superficial things cloud my judgment of what truly matters in life. But now, I understand that the most important thing is not wealth or fame, it's the people who truly love us." He turned to Rose, his eyes reflecting deep gratitude. "Mrs. Rose has spent her entire life caring for me, loving me like a real mother. But I hurt her. I made her endure things she never should have had to." He stepped forward and gently took her hand. "But from now on, I will never let that happen again." Rose smiled, but tears silently fell from her eyes. The entire room was overcome with emotion. Alexander's loved ones looked at him with pride. Emma whispered to Cameron, "At last, the young master finally understands what truly matters." Cameron nodded, his eyes filled with satisfaction. The evening continued with warm laughter. No more tension, no more harsh words. Only love and the unity of a real family. Alexander knew he couldn't change the past, but he could make the present and future better. And he would do everything to make sure Rose knew she was never forgotten. After the tribute dinner, the atmosphere in the estate became warmer than ever. Alexander's loved ones could truly see the change in him. He was no longer the indifferent, detached man he once was. Now, he was a grown man who cherished the people who mattered in his life. The next morning, Alexander woke up earlier than usual. He no longer slept in, no longer spent his mornings indulging in lavish breakfasts or endless meetings. Today, he had something more important to do. He went straight to the garden, where Rose was tending to the rose bushes. She wore a light blue sweater, looking as simple and graceful as ever. Alexander slowly walked up to her. "Good morning, Mrs. Rose." Rose looked up and smiled. "Good morning, my boy." Alexander knelt down and carefully pulled a few weeds beside her. Rose chuckled softly. "My boy, doing gardening? That's a rare sight." Alexander laughed along. "I never used to appreciate the value of small things, but now, I want to change." Rose was silent for a moment before she gently said, "You've changed a lot, Alexander." He nodded, his eyes full of determination. "I've wasted too much time realizing what truly matters. But now, I won't let you be disappointed anymore." Rose placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling warmth in her heart like never before. She knew the man standing before her was no longer the naive boy she once cared for. He had truly grown up. At the same time, the news about Victoria kept getting worse. She had tried to find a way back into high society, but no one would accept her anymore. The connections that once flattered her had now turned their backs. The brands and businesses that once collaborated with her had all withdrawn their contracts. No one wanted to be associated with a cruel, arrogant woman who valued nothing but herself. Victoria had lost everything. She made one last attempt to contact Alexander, but her calls were never answered. Her messages remained unanswered forever. At last, she understood it was over. No one cared about her anymore. No more fame. No more status. No more Alexander. She had lost everything because of her own ruthlessness and ambition. Meanwhile, Alexander decided to do something special for Rose. That evening, he gathered all his loved ones in the living room. Emma, Margaret, Andrew, Cameron, they were all there. Alexander stood up, looking around the room before speaking slowly. "Tonight, I want to do something important." Everyone looked at him, waiting. Alexander turned to Rose, his eyes filled with respect and love. "Mrs. Rose, you have cared for me like your own son all your life. You were there when I was sick, when I struggled, when I lost my way." He took a deep breath before continuing. "But I have never truly done anything to repay you. Today, I want to change that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a white envelope, handing it to Rose. Rose looked surprised as she opened the envelope, her eyes widening at what she saw inside. It was a property deed, a small house in the peaceful countryside she had always loved. Alexander smiled softly. "I know you've always loved peace and quiet. I bought this house for you, so you could have a place that truly belongs to you." Rose shook her head, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Alexander, you didn't have to do this." He took her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I did. Because you deserve it." The room was filled with emotion. Margaret placed a hand over her heart, her eyes brimming with tears. Andrew nodded in approval, while Emma hugged Rose tightly. "You deserve this, Mrs. Rose," Emma said, her voice trembling. Rose looked around, her heart overflowing with happiness. She had never expected anything from Alexander. She had only loved him unconditionally. But today, she realized that love had been returned. She was no longer alone. She had a real family. The next day, Alexander and Rose went to visit her new home. It was a small but cozy house, with a garden full of flowers just as she had always dreamed. Rose stepped inside, looking around with eyes full of gratitude. "My boy. I never thought I would have a place like this." Alexander smiled, pulling out a chair for her to sit. "You deserve it, Mrs. Rose. You spent your whole life taking care of me. Now, I want you to enjoy peaceful days." Rose took his hand, squeezing it gently. "But no matter where I am, I will always be a part of you, right?" Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with deep sincerity. "You are not just a part of me. You are my family. And you always will be." Rose smiled, tears of happiness rolling down her face. The story didn't just end with Victoria's downfall, but with Alexander's rebirth and the love he gave to Rose. Not money. Not fame. It was love and gratitude that created true happiness. And this time, Alexander knew he would never again lose what mattered most in his life. The story emphasizes that true value does not lie in wealth or status but in love and gratitude. Alexander had made the mistake of letting silence cause pain to the most important person in his life, Rose. But when he woke up, he knew how to correct his mistakes and cherish those who loved him unconditionally. On the other hand, Victoria, with her arrogance and cruelty, had to pay the price: her own loneliness.